I would like to welcome to the stage the panelists for this next session. They really need no introduction, I think, but we'll just give a short one on the way up and look forward for them to talk about themselves during the session. First of all, Richard Vecqueray, got that right, from Map of Ag. Come on up. And thank you to Map of Ag as well for being one of our sponsors. Fiona Simson, I don't know if I can get it all, the Vice President of the World Farmers Organization, thrilled to see Director of the New South Wales BCT, and as well a Nature Repair Committee member, so a lot to hear there. And Sue McCluskey, just freshly back from Europe, and obviously the Special Representative for Australian Agriculture. I'll just make a move down here. So I think the last session, and thank you, Adam, I think you've set this up perfectly in terms of thinking globally and acting locally. With so much diversity here, Map of Ag, very engaged across the data and technology landscape, and with all of your extreme leadership and passion in what you do, we've got a lot to talk about. So my job is pretty easy with these awesome panelists. I really would like to kind of set us out in terms of why this is important, how might we as Australia really leverage the global perspective, and what's happening next. So I'll steer us along. The Slido again is open, so keep the questions coming. We'll make sure to have plenty of time for open interaction. But just to kick things off, you all spend a lot of your time abroad, locally. A lot of what you do is engaging, whether it's with customers around the world or other leaders. There's a lot of great passion that goes into it, a lot of outcome that comes out of it. But really, in terms of the why do you do it personally? I'm going to start with you, Fiona. And why is it so important, not only for you as a farmer, but everyone in this room?
Thanks so much, and just a small question to start us off, I suppose, really. But look, it's for me, it's always been a bit of a personal passion, to be quite honest. So, family farmer from the Liverpool Plains, everybody knows, of course, the best farming land in the whole of Australia, but we won't talk about that now. And for me, it's incredibly important that our farm is sustainable. We're into my son, we've just done the whole succession-y thing, or it's very well and truly in its midst. We've handed over the day-to-day running of our farm to our son and daughter-in-law. My husband and I are very much taking a back seat, still involved in the business part of the business, but letting them do the day-to-day things, and we're there when we're needed and not when we're not. So for me, that is incredibly important, that the farm is sustainable, not just for us as we took over from Ed's family, but for the next generation. And that morphed into a slightly bigger outcome for me when I got involved in some local issues around the Liverpool Plains, and I realised that sustainability was not just about our farm, it was actually about the whole region. And then as we got more and more involved in that issue and that space, then I realised that in actual fact it's not just about our region, it's actually about the whole of Australia and the whole of the industry and in the whole of the world, and it's just gone on and on and on from there. But for me, producing food and fibre is incredibly important. Looking after our land is incredibly important. Farmers do both, and we need to keep doing that. And as each generation on our own farm has evolved, and maybe that's something we forget a little bit sometimes when we're right in the middle of this, some of these really complex policy issues, then, farming evolves as well. And I look back at the history of our own farm, how much we've changed. We've gone sort of from wool to sheep to farming to no-tills to we're now doing some carbon farming and other things like that as well. So I think if we can keep making sure that Australian farmers are well represented on the global stage, if we can keep making sure that the policy includes input from people who are doing it every day, then we're going to be better off and we're going to be sustainable in all ways. And one last thing. So sustainability, yes, it's, a lot of times people think it's just about economic, but it's not. About environmental, but it's not. It's about the E and the S and the G. So we might explore that a bit more later. But for me, it's those things and making sure that that's included in the global conversation that's really important to me.
Thank you. And Richard?
Thank you. So it is a huge question, why? And I guess if I really sort of dial it back to why I'm sat here today, it's a very circuitous route. And essentially that started with frustration, I think, back in sort of 95, 96, as a vet up in the Lake District of the UK, seeing a lot of suffering, really, on farm in terms of preventable problems in farm animals. So I was having to react a lot, and it came at a personal cost, because you're out at 3 in the morning dealing with problems that were entirely preventable through management, better nutrition, better holistic approach taken by the farm. So this steadily moved, driven by that sort of frustration and the desire to have a bigger influence on farms. So moved into consultancy, and that work back in then 2006 brought me to be working for some of the biggest and the highest yielding dairy farms throughout the UK as a sort of management consultant, sort of from a veterinary perspective for those guys. And those guys introduced me, those farmers, to Sainsbury's, who were one of the bigger retailers in the UK. And Sainsbury's were looking to set up a direct supply chain from their milk producers. So they set up a group of about 330 farmers, and they wanted to basically ask my advice on how we could set up the health and welfare aspects of that initiative. So we basically looked at all that and said, there's all this data out there, we could bring that data together, that's great for the farmers potentially to see how they perform relative to other farmers. Potentially over time, that's interest for Sainsbury's. So we went on to deliver that. Went from being a farm consultancy to a supply chain consultancy and ultimately a data business. And really that brings me back to that sort of then I was able to sort of roll out that measurement, that management sort of philosophy to 330 farms and then ultimately to other businesses like Sainsbury's and ultimately around the world, go beyond dairy farming into other livestock sectors and ultimately into arable and produce as well. So it's those same numbers around numbers of livestock, the incidence of various issues that are highly applicable, obviously, to the sustainability space around the environment. So I kind of moved on from an animal welfare sort of passion to sort of an environmental sort of holistic passion around all those farmings, all those aspects of the ring around the Australian sustainability framework that were put up there. So it was that was really nice to see from your presentation. So I think that's a really good approach.
Great. A wonderfully holistic view of sustainability in your career. So Sue, just coming back from a few different places, and I know Rome was one of them. What is your why?
Well, my why is very easy because I'm passionate about Australian agriculture and rural and regional Australia, and I like to make a difference. And what I find in this role is that it gives me the unique opportunity to really bring together what I know as a farmer and what I know from a policy background, and I've had a long policy background across primarily tax and economic and regional development policy. But what I'm able to do in this role, and there's nothing better than being able to engage in deep discussions, which I've been able to do in the last week in London, Rome and Paris. Sounds like a great holiday, but it was work the whole time. But when you actually engage in those discussions and you can say, well, from a farmer perspective, this is how it can work in practice. And you find that you're only a person in the room that's actually able to do that because you're actually speaking with policy development people, economic development people, government officials, sometimes politicians or bureaucrats. And so being able to bring that absolutely grassroots perspective is really, really important. I often say if it doesn't work in practice, we're never going to get the policy to actually work. So that's what's critical. And what I'm finding in this role is that, and I say sometimes I can nudge and sometimes I need to shove, but the ability to influence is something that really drives me. And I see myself both as a conduit and a concierge. So I'm a conduit to actually hear the information both on the ground here and feed it into government or even overseas, but also hear what the global conversations are, bring them back, share them with industry and government here and see how that may actually help to shape what we're doing. And then, of course, connect the dots, which is something that we'll come back to, I think, as we have more questions.
Most definitely. And again, Adam, you really asked us to look out globally at best practice, whether that's policy, technology. So obviously you're all doing that. I guess moving a little bit towards the direction of how you're seeing all of that, how do you start to link that back into Australia? And Fiona, I might just start with you, given you've kind of moved into the next phase and focusing on biodiversity and nature repair. It is something that, you know, I personally believe Australia has a very large part to play in. It's part of the balance of nature, climate, and productivity. It's so important. How do you see that evolving for Australia, taking the best from the world practice?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. When I was at the NFF, we had quite a strong view about pretty much what Sue was saying just then, actually, that a lot of these conversations that happen in government, amongst policymakers, the policies that come out amongst the community, need to be informed by agriculture. And, you know, we used to talk about the Reserve Bank Board, for example, and other things like that. So when I was approached about an opportunity to go on the Climate Change Authority and the Nature Repair Committee, even though, you know, there was quite a competitive process and, you know, as there should be, I really jumped at the opportunity, because I think to be able to sit in those rooms and give my first-hand knowledge about what I know that farmers in Australia are doing is absolutely really valuable for policy development. And you know, when you talk about responding to the rest of the world, I think sometimes in Australia we get a bit hung up about responding to the rest of the world. Yeah, they're drivers, and yeah, there's a lot of them up in that northern hemisphere, and you know, yeah, they like to think they rule the world, but we're bloody good in Australia at what we do. And in some of these things, we're leading the world. And the AASF that we had up there on the screen, Sue's taken it, Tony's taken it, I've taken it, Adam's taken it, we've all taken it everywhere. And everybody, we've taken it to COP, we've showed it, we've been asked for extra copies, we've had farmer groups going to their governments in South America. It's something that is quite unique. And it's world leading. So why are we not, embracing that with 50 hands, hugging it tight? Helping boost it through our whole industry to make sure that it's heard more globally. So I think, yes, there are pressures coming from overseas. There certainly is globally. That you cannot deny that there is a huge conversation about climate change and a huge conversation about nature repair. In my experience, I think Aussie farmers are up for it. And as I say, not just up for it, but leading the way. And so as long as we can see at the end of the day policy that comes through government in some of these areas that is going to hugely influence what we do, or has the capacity to hugely influence what we do, then I think we're better placed, and that's where we should be. And so that's why I see those roles as really important. And also the World Farmers is just like NFF on steroids, really. It's, instead of herding cats, it's like herding lions and tigers and elephants and things. But it brings in all the different perspectives to come out with a view that is unashamedly farmer-focused, that is now being put forward at the WTO, at the UN, at the FAO, all these different places. So again, I think let's not get defensive as an industry. Let's not feel that we're having to fight the fight all the time. Let's keep being proud about what we do and show what we're doing through the things that we've got.
Absolutely awesome, and probably a very different cross section. And then I promise we'll bounce around a little bit more. But Richard, I know you're spending time influencing data platforms, companies, for how they think about how they're integrating data and using data. We're a tough crowd, often in the corporate world, constrained, sometimes think we know it better. But you're out there seeing a lot. I guess for you, how do you see this progressing? Whether it's your solution or otherwise, I guess how do you see us underpinning more of what we do with facts?
So I think every speaker today at some point has referred to the need for data and better data in this space, and the need for facts and science. Refer variously versions of the, to anchor these claims and these messages around. So there's, I love coming to Australia. I've come to Australia like 6 times, I think, in the last 12 months. And I think if you were summing up in one word for the country, it's opportunity. There's like massive things to be proud of. The fact that I can go to a supermarket and absolutely fill my trolley with stuff completely grown within or reared within Australia is amazing. You can't do that. You just cannot do that in a UK supermarket. So that's something. And then you've got a certain scale relative to the other market we operate in, which is New Zealand, but still an export mindset. So there's a huge opportunity if you're willing to sort of embrace it and market and tell the story hinged around the facts. I think Liz Truss, she did 2 things. She cost me hundreds of pounds a month in terms of my mortgage payments. Complete incompetence in terms of the economics management in her short tenure. And she did you guys a huge favour in terms of the trade agreement, in terms of opening up the doors to that to the UK market, at least, sort of thing. And there's a certain, just like in Australia, there's a certain reticence within the UK farming things. You'll have learned something about that in your trip, so about the struggles that Red Tractor have had to try and push a green agenda, and market sort of British produce from a green perspective. And I think that opens up a chink for you guys if you're willing to embrace that and sort of steal a march on that, because I know the UK supermarkets are coming out here in the next months, and they're looking to see where they can get at what sort of standards. So it's an opportunity.
Excellent to spot out. And what has stood out for you in terms of kind of case studies out there that you've seen? The AASF for Australia outwards, I love that. That's certainly one. But what else do you see that that's really struck you in your work?
Well, certainly the AASF for me, as Fiona has said, it's a showcase. Any country I go into, and I put that slide up. It is our overarching articulation of Australian agriculture's commitment to sustainability. No other country has that overarching narrative. They have individual industry parts, and of course we have that as well. What I have really seen come to the fore, though, is that we focus very much on the carbon side and the emissions side. But of course, we had the Nature Positive Summit only a week and a half ago. And of course, we've got the Nature Repair Act. We're starting to talk about biodiversity credits and the marketplace there. And if you look to the right-hand side of that AASF, you'll see biodiversity, land, soils. So it's very much about embracing that as we move to a more cohesive and collective discussion around the world around natural capital, nature positive, and what this actually means. A lot harder to measure, but some of the discussions I was having, particularly in the UK, was thinking there around, and they've been doing a lot of work around natural capital, around how we actually can look to measure this. A lot harder than measuring carbon and emissions, but it's certainly the way the world is going. Canada and New Zealand, I didn't quite see that, but certainly they would be like-minded with us. But there are real opportunities, I think, for partnerships, particularly with the UK. But I want to pick up also on something that I think a couple of speakers have spoken about, and what Katie said about stop, collaborate and listen. I quite often say connect, collaborate and communicate. And I think it is about making those connections, and in my role I can make that around the world. It is about collaboration. I mean, I always give the Team Australia narrative when I'm in country, but the communication is absolutely critical, because we must be able to communicate. And with all due respect to everyone in this room, we've actually got to be able to communicate with those outside of our industry sector. Something that came through so strongly to me in the UK where they're very domestically focused. They don't think export. The retail sector, so primarily the supermarkets, are driving the sustainability and the credentials side, but they have got a strong connection with the consumer, and we absolutely have to make sure that the consumer understands where their food comes from. It doesn't come from a supermarket. It comes from farmers, and agriculture is critical, and that's why we've got to get more mainstream in our conversations.
Excellent. And you had kind of raised the point of leadership in the last session in our earlier discussion, and you certainly just touched on that. Communication is a big part of good leadership. You know, I guess even in our own business, as we're implementing natural capital accounts, it's a big shift to people that have really been focused, you know, on sustainable practice, but really productivity first and foremost, and natural capital accounts helps you do that as well, but it adds a whole nother lens having an ecologist on your farm and making it all very transparent. I guess, what are your perspectives for everybody in the room in terms of leadership, change management? You're doing a lot of it today. What do you think we can all do more of there to help really accelerate what you're talking about and grab those opportunities, whether they're in the UK, Japan, or India?
Well, maybe I'll jump in to follow on. It's all of our responsibility. So every single one of us need to lead in, take that responsibility and go forward and act. We can't say and point the finger at others or say it's other groups or it's the responsibility of someone globally. If we all actually lean in and take action, and that includes communicating outside of this room, I think that is really where real leadership lies, to actually make sure that you act yourself.
When I think I made my first trip to Europe with NFF, was some years ago now, and we started saying, you know, we're here and we're clean and green. And everyone went, yeah, we've heard that one. And that was back then that they said that. And so I guess for me, it is challenging. Some of the things that we're facing on farms now are challenging. You know, proving our economic credentials, proving our sustainability. And you've got to do all of that while you're trying to make sure that you get the money side of it working as well. And the whole succession. I mean, it's complex, and small communities and everything. It's really, really complex. And I think that's why, you know, I agree with Sue. We need to lean in, everybody needs to lean in. And, you know, on farm now, getting back to Richard's data thing, the amount of data that we collect on farms is extraordinary. And whilst my generation was sort of going, oh yeah, that's nice, perhaps, you know, look at all this data coming in. The next generation and and future farmers and farmers that are out there now, you know, actively, I shouldn't be too rude about our generation, because so many of us are really tech savvy as well and data savvy. But that data tells a story, and it's a story that when you combine it with something like the AASF, sorry Richard, I don't mean to point at you, at the AASF, then it actually tells a really meaningful story in the dialogues that we're trying to build and the narrative that we're trying to build and the policy that we're trying to build about nature positive. So my role in those committees is making sure that the voice of agriculture and what actually happens on farm is actually heard, that an ideal state of affairs for me is that, just as our 2030 roadmap says, you know, 5% of every farmer's income is ecosystem services, that every farmer has the opportunity to be able to build some and get paid for some natural capital on their farm in some way, and that's how some of these policies are now evolving. And there have been policies that have been over successive governments, so we've been working long and hard in this space. But I do think every farmer, you know, and I do think now, farmers are starting to think, okay, what does my farm look like? You know, natural capital, it's not just trees. Nature, it's not just trees. Biodiversity, it's not just trees. It can be trees, but it can also be, somebody was showing me the other day at the Nature Positive Summit, pictures of little tiny bugs in their crops. Little coloured ones, they were red and blue and green, and they were really exciting little bugs. And I urged them to share that online, because, you know, in actual fact, biodiversity is really complex. It's the things in the water, it's the things in the soil, it's the things above the soil, and farmers are doing a lot to enhance all of that. So that's my first comment. The second quick one is that when I sat down and read Katie's, I quickly flicked through Katie's little thing that everybody's got at the front. I don't know what you call that, Katie, an essay, an expose, a thought dump, something like that. Anyway, it said that farmers were the most trusted industry. And I actually went online to check your source because they are. So Pollinate survey at the end of 2023, late last year, farmers are the most trusted sector in the Australian economy. Now, why, that's what we have to remember at the end of the day. The community is with us. Yes, we have to keep building the connections between them, and they don't know what we're doing, and all of this. But at the end of the day, we're the most trusted sector. You don't make stuff like that up. So let's just keep building that trust with data. Let's keep building the frameworks. Let's keep focusing on what we're doing, and it's really important that we do with the way that we trade and the way we're export imposed and everything else like that exposed.
So in terms of what the room can do, just to bring together the 2 points that Fiona and Sue made, really, would be that the data is out there. So it's that data ecosystem is, it's not amazing in Australia, but it's okay. It's enough. There's enough there. Around each farm to do the measurement that's needed. But to be able to connect that and deliver that up through the supply chain to the consumer, to bring the consumer closer to the farm, which has to be better for the consumer and the farmer, because it's easier to add value if you can get closer to that consumer to sort of explain why you're doing it, what you're doing, why you should pay a bit more. So you need that data sharing. And for that data to be shared, you need trust, as you said. So, and to deliver trust, you need to communicate. So what you all need to start doing, because to build that trust takes time. So you need to, for those of you involved beyond the farm gate in the supply chain, you need to start setting up farmer groups and delivering forums to deliver.
Groups.
Yeah.
No more groups.
Well, stakeholders, where you can deliver those, maybe not. having heard a few things this morning, okay, no more groups. But lines of communication. Leverage the ones that are there. There you go. Okay. So,
We got you back. We got
but
you
to
back.
make sure, to get that, those comments, so to develop that mutual understanding of why you might want that data over the next 2-3 years, for what purpose. There's no agenda. You're not going to take advantage of those farmers any more than has taken place in the foods. It's for their benefit to explain your position and explain what the consumer needs from you and what the regulations are demanding of you, sort of thing. So develop mutual understanding through communication.
Excellent. Well, before we go to Slido, any burning questions out there in the room we want to start out with?
While you're just doing that, can I just make one comment? The other thing is that from the world, so the World Farmers brings together, as I said, it's like NFF on steroids. It brings together, we've got members from nearly every country in Africa, from the not enough from the Asia Pacific. We've got Asia, we've got the developed countries, got developing countries like Cambodia and all sorts of others. Every farmer, every farmers group, every farmer is feeling the same as we are feeling. And some are feeling a lot worse because some of those developing countries, some of the rules and the frameworks that are being parlayed around the global scene at the moment are going to be really, really devastating to them. And so I think, we mustn't also think that we're alone, because we're not. And just as when you look at what the Australian government's doing in the defence space, it's not going and putting missiles up on all our Pacific Nation islands and things like that. It's doing other things. And so I think, let's remember, first of all, we're not in it alone. Let's remember, yes, it's challenging, yes, it's scary sometimes, but yes, we're right, we've got it. But also there's a whole bigger environment of farmers out there that are with us on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a great question from Raylene Ward. Thank you. What is your understanding of Indigenous peoples' involvement internationally that can inform our efforts here in Australia?
Well, I would just say not enough. I think in the WFO, I'm not sure that we have specific Indigenous representations or First Nations representatives. And so I think the way that that we work together could be much better.
I think that we are starting to look at, particularly when I look at what we're doing with the Ag and Land Sector Plan, but also what's coming out of the Nature Repair Act and who's to engage, that we can do. We can do more, but we are starting to think about it. And look, I had to do a social media in Paris on Friday, and it was one of those sort of hard quiz things, and it was traditional or innovation was one of the questions. And I actually said it's both, because we need innovation and we need technology, and that's actually going to help to harness some of the advancements we're able to make in real time. But we actually need to also draw on the traditional ways of doing things, which we can clearly see when it comes to emissions reduction and achieving our targets, such as savanna burning and those sort of things. So I think it can be both, and we need to think about how we harness that.
Definitely. And just to the question of, I guess, harnessing data that's out there, is there much that you're seeing in terms of regenerative practices or others that you're being asked to collect or think about in your work?
Yeah, so as I say, we started in sort of animal welfare, responsible use of antimicrobials. It very quickly moved on to overlaying production efficiency over the top of that, and then it was all, the last 3 years has all been about emissions measurement, and those other factors have become very much business as usual. But as of the last year now, there's a real focus of the supply chain. So I speak with very industry perspective from this. So the supply chain, the industry, asking for the regenerative practices, what is being undertaken on the farm, and start the measurement of those. So the only scaled measurement of those has really started over the last quarter, I would say, the last year, and that's being rolled out by some of the big global corporates there. But that is coming thick and fast in terms of the regenerative agricultural practices and saying what is happening where. Sustainable agriculture, it comes under different names in different regions, for various reasons. But yeah, absolutely.
And I'll just add to that, that's the huge opportunity for Australia as we move into the nature positive arena. We've been doing fantastic things, not just for decades, but sometimes for centuries. We've been clearly looking at biodiversity, looking after our soils, thinking about water conservation. A lot of the countries I go to, they're just starting that. They're talking about preservation. In the UK, virtually all of their land has been turned into agricultural land or is being utilised in some way. So they're actually having to go back and say, how do we fix this? Whereas we've got some of the oldest soils in the world, we've got a lot of land that we've had to think about how we use it in different ways. And it actually is more about coexistence. So it's not just conservation, it's not just environment or agriculture, they can coexist. And it's about thinking how we do that. And so we've got great examples we're going to be able to provide to the rest of the world around how we do that.
Yeah, and that links nicely actually to one of the questions here. Is there space for a more diversified Australian ag to prepare for the more volatile and uncertain world? And I guess related to that, how does the current market logic need to change? I think that kind of builds nicely into your comments.
Well, I think we're seeing, another thing, sorry, I do have way too many hats on, but another hat that I wear is the Trade 2040 committee that sits with Minister Farrell and talks about what trade should look like in 2040. It only meets a couple of times a year, so it's not so onerous. But I think yesterday we were talking about the shape of Australia's exports. I don't think I'm breaking any confidences here. Because we were looking at the change that has happened, which is very publicly available. And I think that shows, and of course we're hoping to pick up some trends and keep building on those trends. Now, agriculture has changed quite significantly in some ways. In other ways, it's stayed the same. So we have our staple, crops and animals. But we're also seeing things like horticulture coming into their own now. And Southeast Asia, a lot of our agreements were done in Southeast Asia some time ago, our trade agreements. And so the government now has a focus on modernising some of those and changing some of those and updating some of those. And the government is really focused on trying to keep pursuing the trade subsidies, the agricultural trade subsidies, the WTO's role in terms of a rules-based trading system, et cetera. So I think if we're talking about a change in climate and how ag is going to change, I think some of those industries like horticulture, where you can control the environment a little bit more, where you can, I sit on the board of Future Food Systems CRC, we're looking at indoor cropping, we're looking at, the gut health what your gut health is like, and how different sorts of foods can actually contribute to your gut health, and some of those foods are really quite unique and niche. So I think Australia has been like a big exporter of bulk products, but we're seeing now some of that change to a more niche product. Some of those niche producers are doing quite well. You're right, Richard, the UK supermarkets have been over here. They're coming again probably. I met with some of them last year. They're very interested in our grass-fed cattle, etc., for example, things like that are accredited. So, and First Nations, to Raylene's question, we had a whole report yesterday on First Nations exports. So I think, I'm really confident in Australian farmers. I mean, I think we are the best in the world, and I think we do change and evolve and adapt, and as these opportunities come up more, we will pursue them with our business. We don't just stay static and do the same thing. And so I think some of those places, some of those things that we can now achieve, that certification we can achieve through data, is actually going to enable us to then focus on some of those markets a bit better too.
Definitely. So any questions here? Hey, Emma? Oh,
there's one down there too.
there's one here.
Thanks, Justin. I'm going to go back to one of Katie's statements earlier, that 50% of our farmers have had suicidal thoughts. You guys are saying we're the best in the world. I agree with you. I'm actually from the UK as well. I can see some of what Richard's saying there. But I'm really concerned that the farming community in Australia is feeling more under stress than it's ever felt before because of the nature repair, the climate, the blah, 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 all these things that they feel are being imposed on them, and they don't feel they're the best in the world. How do we communicate that message and ensure that they're actually holding their heads proud and don't take them off?
Yeah, it's such an important question. And my heart breaks when I see those figures. And I know firsthand as a farmer the challenges that farmers are up against. And yes, I'm an optimist and I paint a positive picture, but it's tough sometimes, and you can do the best things you can. You can put, look at that frost event that happened in the south not that long ago. People had basically, it was coming right at the end of their crops. They'd spent everything on it. They'd put all their heart and soul into it, and then a frost event, So I totally get it, and it's such an important question. So for me, it's about, most challenges, if you look at them the right way, can be an opportunity. And so for me, the world, the biggest opportunity is the world needs to eat, okay? And yes, you can go on about cellular technology and growing, petri dishes full of food and, blah, 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 blah. But at the moment, the world needs to eat, and that's what we do. And so there's an opportunity in there as we look at, and because I do fervently believe that we are some of the most sustainable farmers in the world, I do believe that we are some of the best at what we do in the world. I do believe we've got the data, even if it's not quite joined up yet, to prove that. And so for me, the last piece of the puzzle is putting in place policies that actually reflect that and enable us to work in that space where we can produce good stuff and it's not just an either or. It's not just about being nature positive or about producing food. And so in the rooms I'm in, I challenge it all the time. So I was in a room the other day, and one of the big mining, I won't name them, one of the big mining companies said, we're putting 1 million hectares towards nature positive across the world. And I went, but what about food? And they went, oh, maybe we could work with farmers. So, it's that sort of thing that happens. So I haven't got an easy answer to you. I think we do need champions in local communities that can drive some of that positive thinking. I do think we need to have an approach. We've asked in our 2030 roadmap, which everybody supported, which governments of all colours supported, which industry supported, farmers supported, everybody supported it. We actually forecast that we were heading towards these things and we were good at them. So I think sometimes it's about turning those challenges into opportunities. It's about trying to live the day and feel supported. And it's about also making sure that you feel that you're as well placed as you can to take on some of those challenges by getting information from sources that. So, and that's the last thing I will say. Sorry, I know I'm rabbiting on a bit, but you never give me a microphone. But I think to just be interested in what you're reading. Because, you know, we've talked about social media, we've talked about what rubbish there is on the, out there on the waves. And just make sure sometimes when you're reading about some of this stuff that you are informed by facts and stuff, facts and credible data.
And I'll just add, because I agree with everything you've said, Fiona, but I think the thing we've always got to remember, and we can sit up here and bang on about sustainability and Nature Repair Acts and biodiversity, because we get it, that's the world we work in. But for farmers on the ground, they understand risk, they understand profitability, they understand productivity. And so we've actually got to have multiple different narratives depending on the audience, and we need to actually have farmers on the ground actually communicating with other farmers that this isn't about just more compliance burden, more hard work, more effort for less money. It really is framed in the way of how do we actually work with you to make sure that we can get you more money, because that's what it's all about. It's got to come down to profitability. That's the value proposition we've actually got to turn this into in terms of how we actually speak to farmers.
Yeah, I would just add, I guess, the hope. There's a lot of work to do, a lot of policy to put in place, but if we get to a drought, maybe that's 8-10 years from now, that there really is a revenue stream, you know, linked to carbon and biodiversity that's real. I think every little bit helps, and I do remember sitting with Fiona and a few others, I think, at that table last year, and we did talk about best practice sharing, case studies, whether it's market access, but something that's real. I don't think any one thing is the solution, Emma, but thank you so much for raising that point.
And the trusted advisor network too is something that comes up a lot in, like, where do farmers turn to for their good advice? I think that's something too, like, you know, I mean, I think there's certain, you know, farmers have advisors on hand all the time, but you want to make sure that they're the ones that can unpick the complexity for you. They're the ones that can give you advice that you're going to trust. They're the ones that, you know, will give you the confidence to do what you're going to do and make you feel that you're not floundering.
I think that's the key thing, is just encouraging people, farmers, to talk about their feelings. I think there's a lot of bravado and sort of that comes with the isolation. I mean, and the point, I've seen a lot of, you know, had a lot of friends, you know, go through all these issues and lost friends in farming through these things over the years. And I've also been involved in auditing a lot of farms that were failing various standards along the way, and be that for animal welfare or for any other issues around food safety or compliance issues. And almost every time there is a human story behind that failure sort of thing. It's not an animal welfare. You know, the outcome is an animal welfare issue or a compliance issue, but the cause is a family breakdown, a mental health issue. So it's vital, you know, for the holistic approach that we must take to sort of get people talking and sort of around these things, which is the only route out of that.
There's a question here that's quite near and dear to my heart as AFI Director. The Australian Agriculture Sustainability Framework, it's a great policy tool. It's a framework today. How do we take its strengths and gain a competitive advantage actually in export markets? What is that next step? And there's probably other people in the room from NFF that can contribute as well. So feel free to grab the mic after. But yeah, what do you think it takes to make it real and bring the premium and the positive stories back to our farmers?
Certainly building on the data that we have will start to enable sustainability credentials. So we've actually got to prove what we're doing. At the moment, that's our articulation. Some of the individual industry sector sustainability frameworks are really starting to move towards the proof, and the proof has got to be in the pudding. We've got to be realistic. I think that is going to really help in terms of our trade and market access. Is it going to actually get a premium? In some markets perhaps, but premiums only last for so long and then they tend to get baked in. Early adopters may get the premium and the others don't necessarily get that. So really, we've got to think about getting that, not just maintaining the market access we have now, but being able to grow that. That goes and really goes to what Adam was saying about the growth that we want to see in the ag sector. And once again, it's got to come back to more money in a farmer's pocket, because we're about the only farmers in the world that are not subsidised in some way. And every time I go into another country and, you know, they tell me about what they're doing and the big bucket of money, even in the UK and their transition plan, the bucket of money they can draw on to pay farmers, we don't have that. So we've actually got to make sure that we're thinking about how we actually are doing things that make absolute business sense for farmers.
I would say knowledge is power, and the AASF gives us a framework whereby a lot of other things come into that framework to give that framework the data. So it's a framework, right? So, you know, you've got other schemes that are collecting data and other things that are happening underneath that feed all up into that framework. But what it does do is it gives, you know, and I'm thinking immediately of the EU FTA. Now, I don't think it probably played a part in that. But, you know, when the negotiators go into a room and, you know, they are talking about, you know, climate change credentials, and the EU goes, oh, well, ours is the best, and, you know, we want to do, you know, CBAM and blah, 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 blah. Well, you have to have something. We can't just say, oh, but we're clean and green, okay, because it doesn't work like that. And we're really different to what they do, what they are in the Northern Hemisphere. Completely different farming systems, and nobody has any understanding of that. So this is the next logical step for me in you know, where we need to go if we're going to not be punished on the global stage, to be honest, and also to open the door for things that can provide more income for farmers, like a biodiversity market or a carbon market or something like that. So it needs to, the government, I think Adam said 7 million, 9 million, something like that, yep. 9, there we go, 9 million. So it can't just now, it's got to this amazing point. It has to go to the next stage. And we need, as I said, all of industry. We need RDCs, advocacy groups, governments, everybody, farmers. Let's take it up to that next level with 50 hands, because that's the only way, if we all get behind it, that it will be strong enough to withstand some of the pressures that we'll be getting in the global framework. But it's built to withstand those pressures. And I think that's the important thing to understand, that when you're looking at global carbon accounting frameworks and things, it's actually built to feed into that. So it needs to go to the next stage.
And yeah, I would just add the AASF. I know I've personally brought into boardrooms of Australian super funds. It's not a question of export markets, but it's a question of how do you provide confidence in an industry that doesn't always get the best press, and there's value to unlock there as well. So it's, yeah, it's got a lot of potential that's not been fully used.
It is potential though, isn't it? Every one of those points is, it has the possibility to underpin it with data or evidence from the farm, I think, from my memory of there. So, and that framework would be familiar to export markets. They have sort of stuff inspired by it that relates to it. So I think if you're an exporter, an industry actor, and you have to ask the question, can you say, you know, tomorrow, you know, what those numbers would look like for each one of those sectors within that AASF framework? And that's where, you know, you've got to get to in terms of marketing and sort of getting that point of difference for Australia.
And in global terms, from the corporate perspective, it speaks to ESG, but it also underpins the SDGs. And wherever I go in the world, and that's not just Europe, you know, I was in Southeast Asia only a couple of weeks ago. SDGs were what were very much front of mind, and I'm actually now thinking that when I put the slide up, I need to put the SDGs up there as well, because that really is something that resonates in global markets.
Particularly number 2.
Yes, very much
Food.
number 2. Zero hunger.
Well, we're creeping over time a little bit, but I don't know when we're going to get the three of you on stage again, so I think that's all right. Any other questions out there? Yeah?
Hi there, Angela Hammond from Landcare Australia here. One of the questions that I feel like connects everything you guys have been talking about, and it's been great, especially Fiona, you just talked about key influencers. So we've got good key influencers in our industry, consultants. There's not very many of them. They're getting exhausted. Now our producers, we talk about these sort of high level intent, things that we think they could be doing, but we need to support them to understand how to do the things that we're proposing will be important in the future. And since the late 80s and early 90s, when old people like me left university, and there were people engaged in training, the Extension and Adoption Network. So when you were a consultant or a facilitator, you were well trained. So different government organisations, New South Wales, Queensland DPI, who I worked for then, they all did their training. That fell over about 15, 20 years ago, and nearly every forum I go to, or every grant application I make for Landcare Ag, there's a big part of that around training. Train the trainer, we say. Apparently some of our government bodies now think because there's been a train the trainer for element for carbon, we never need to do train the trainer again. Well, you do it for carbon, that doesn't actually impact positively for biodiversity, for example. So I'm just wondering, is there going to be a moment when nationally our policymakers can pull together and go, we need to train the extension and adoption framework, we need to provide support for them, professional development, because all the state bodies have stopped doing it. So we probably need a national approach, because our producers need trusted advisors that don't have, that aren't going to earn money from answers, who haven't got a vested interest. They need trusted advisors to be able to support them in all these changes, because to operationalise biodiversity, for example, it's going to take a lot of knowledge transfer and practice change, but they can't do it on their own. And if we don't have an extension and adoption network to take the R&D through to practice change, our producers are getting increasingly sort of confused and a bit frightened, and they won't be able to take that through to practice change.
Yep, that you're right. So I think, I mean, Adam would be the one that would know this. But I think there actually is money in the budget for the network that you're talking about, and we might give Adam the microphone in a minute and he can talk about that. So I won't go there in terms of that. But what I would say is that the other thing that is overlooked a lot is the private network of ag consultants of, well, it is and it isn't. Like they have, like it does cover a certain percentage of the sector. The agronomists, even the agronomists that work for, not the private ones, even the ones that work for, you know, Elders and Nutrien and all those different companies, that one of the complicated things is the information is so complex that farmers need to get across these days. So you're trying to get across information about carbon, about, you know, markets, about biodiversity, about, you know, soils, about water, about everything. It's very, very complex, and farmers don't really know who to trust, and it's hard for farmers. I mean, my son comes to me and goes, what's this additionality thing, Mum? I mean, how come we've got that? Suddenly, where did that come from? But I think, you know, there is a focus on, you're exactly right. I think we do need those networks to be upskilling farmers. We do need networks of people out there that farmers can trust that they're not going to come and, you know, find something wrong on their farm if there is anything wrong on their farm. And I think the government already has money in their budget for that. And that is one of the things we need to keep focusing on, helping farmers unpick some of these things that are out there, because otherwise it does become overwhelming. They don't know who to turn to. They go to social media. They go to who's got the Crop 24, which is full of all sorts of stuff. So I think that's exactly right. Adam, did you want to?
Thanks for the opportunity. My speech was going on for too long, so I cut out all the money bits. But there is, it's really hard to convince governments of any persuasion to invest in capacity building, which is a lot of what you're talking about, including Train the Trainer. We've got a $15 million grant program for that as part of the Climate Smart Ag program. So have a look at the DAF website, and those grants go to small, all the way down to small grants, because that small local capacity building is as critical as the nationwide. And there's also a broader, it's basically part of a $300 million Climate Smart Ag program, which was announced last year. it's really important, and those trusted advisors, all of our research and policy says that's where you get the on-ground change. So it is important, it's a great question, and for anyone interested, go to the DAF website and have a look.
And one last thing, just to be a little bit controversial here, unlike me, is that I'm pretty sure we have a few RDCs in the room as well. So they are about production agriculture, and they are about extension, and they are about research and knowledge sharing. So I don't think we should always look to government for everything. I think, within industry sometimes we do have the money in different places to help do these things. And so if that's a need that people are identifying in the community, in their ag community, they should be actually, as levy payers, put it forward to your RDCs.
Sue's burning.
And I'll be very brief, because this is absolutely where I believe money needs to be put. And there's a few in this room who've heard me use this example before, but I'm an old tax person and was involved with the introduction of the GST. Ooh. The way that we got the whole business community to come along and embrace something that was really hard, and particularly the farming community, was to invest heavily in education, communication, and making sure that we worked with those trusted advisors and all others that could actually get the messages through. And for me, the reform we're looking at now is bigger than tax reform, and so we must invest.
Just super quick. So I think we're asking farmers to change. The advice obviously will come from that trusted network of advisors around them. I think in terms of that, the advisors also need to change. So we've got some massive brains in the agronomists and the vets, and these guys understand technically all the levers that need to be pulled to make farms more sustainable, but they don't like changing either. It's just easy to do what they did yesterday. So I think we need to help them help themselves to retrain to become sustainability advisors, which even the vets I still employ, and the agronomists, and I'm trying to we've got sustainability consultants. You guys speak the same language. You guys just need to reframe sort of how you think about yourselves.
So true. It always comes back to people and the relationship with the grower on the ground. And I'm happy that's kind of where we're ending here. I do want to just wrap up, though, by reminding everyone the conference topic here is walk the talk. And we have talked for a while now on this subject. So just in a very brief kind of departing word, what's your advice to the room to walk the talk? What can we leave with here today? What's the one thing that will make a difference?
It's hard to say one, but I reckon something that the NFF has been promoting for a long time, and that is that I think start looking at these things as opportunities rather than challenges, and start collecting data on your farm. Start being in charge of data on your farm. I know in Queensland, AgCare is doing a good job about bringing farmers data to them to see what their farm is actually doing, and start understanding some of the data flows that you're collecting on your farms anyway, because some of that might give you a bit of a surprise in terms of how good it is, as opposed to being too worried about it. So walking the walk for me is, let's start choosing to be, active thinkers in this space, and start being interested in collecting the data on your farm to start engaging in the space.
Great.
Exactly the same. The one thing, specific farm measurement, and you've got to know the number for every individual farm. They know their own number, and they know the numbers that drive that number. And then that's the only way you will ever drive scale change that you need to drive to achieve these targets that you're setting for yourselves.
Get started, right? Start somewhere.
Exactly. Get started.
Go from there.
Just talk.
I won't talk about data, but you're all leaders in this room. Lean in, go forward. You all do different things, but it's about actually making it happen, so just do it.
Awesome. Well, you are all extreme leaders in our industry, locally and globally. And again, everyone, thank you so much for your time, your attention, engaging and leaning into this conversation. Looking forward to the next 20 years. Thank you.